This is episode 389 of jumbleThink. Hey there, friends. Welcome to jumbleThink. My name's Michael Woodward. I am your host. It's good to be back. We've taken some time off. We took the month of December off to work on getting the studio up and ready for video and going live instead of just pre-recorded podcast interviews. And then at the beginning of 2022, I got a little sick, and so I've been down and under the weather, just trying to keep up with some things and stay healthy. But we're back, and we've got lots of amazing conversations already recorded, ready to go for you. You're going to be hearing them in the next couple of weeks. Today's conversation is one I'm super excited about. Our guest is David Rubenstein. He has a brand new book out called The American Experiment. It's a book, it's just incredible. I have enjoyed reading it. It is a long book, but it feels like it just goes by quickly as you read chapter by chapter of these conversations. David is a New York Times bestselling author. He is the co-founder and chairman of the Carlyle Group, which is one of the world's largest and most successful private investment firms. David Rubenstein is also the chairman of the board of trustees for the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and the Council on Foreign Relations. Beyond that, he's the host of the David Rubenstein Show, which is on both Bloomberg TV and PBS. There's a lot I could tell you about David. There's a lot I could read from his bio. I encourage you, go check out his story, go read up on it. We're going to hear a little bit about that in today's conversation. We're going to be talking about this book. We're going to be talking about the world of business. He has been super entrepreneurial and successful in many different aspects of life. We're going to be talking about the world of politics, something he knows well. It's a really fascinating and fun conversation. So let's go ahead and join the conversation with today's guest, David Rubenstein. Thank you, David, so much for joining us here on jumbleThink. It is truly an honor to have you on the show.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I have the book right here. I've been reading it. As you can see, lots of little flags in there with notes and everything down. I'm truly enjoying this book for many reasons. In the book, one of the things that stood out to me right at the beginning that I'm going to mention is that you talk about let's see here, Ken Burns. When you're talking to Ken, you said something he said something really powerful, and I just want to read that for a second. He said, "What was the biggest surprise you uncovered in research you did?" And Ken answered, "The surprise of my own arrogance. I thought I had lived through the period growing up in a college town where Vietnam was on everyone's mind and lips at the time." And I think that's one of the takeaways as I've read the book is how much I thought I knew about certain things and the revelation that came from reading from the different experts that you had in these different interviews you did, learning from them. I think that's part of the American story. This book, The American Experiment, Dialogues on a Dream, is that I think we don't know as much as we think about our own story. Is that what you've taken away from the book?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I did it. As you probably know from reading the book, there's a lack of knowledge of American history and civics in our younger people, let's say, and probably in our older people as well. We haven't taught civics or American history as much as maybe we should. I would not be surprised if young Chinese students know more about American history than young American students know for a lot of reasons. But I thought I knew a fair bit about American history myself. And obviously, when I prepared for the interviews, I learned a lot. But then when I did the interviews, I learned even more. So nobody really knows as much probably as they should. And I'm certainly one of those.
Your background's very interesting in that you came from a blue collar background. Your dad was a postal worker, your mom was a homemaker, and you have had kind of what we would consider an American dream story, going from that into the world of law, into the world of politics, into the world of equity funding. You've had this interesting journey. When was that moment for you where you said, what is it about this American experiment that was profound that you said, I want to explore this more?
Well, when I got to the White House as a young lawyer, I was working at the White House in the West Wing when I was 27. Then I began to think, wow, how did I get that? Then when my investment firm took off and made a fair amount of money for me and my partners, I began to think, how did that happen? And then generally, as other things came along and I became the chairman of various nonprofit boards, I thought, how did this happen? So it's been the American dream for quite some time. But one of the pleasures of living the American dream is having your parents see it. And fortunately, my parents lived long enough to see the success that I had. And I always ask people, as you may notice in many of the interviews, did your parents live to see the success? Because I think one of the great pleasures in life is being able to please your parents and having parents be proud of what their children have done.
Yeah, I think that's really a powerful statement. It's that standing on the shoulder of giants as we go generation to generation. Our hope is that I have two young daughters. I know you have children of your own, that our children have a better world, a better life, a better opportunity than we could face. And I'm curious, and we're going to talk about this later in the interview about where you see the American dream going. But do you feel like what you experienced was some magic? What was it that gave you that opportunity? Was it the education? Was it what your parents had done to set you up for success? Was it just the right opportunities at the right time? What kind of opened up the path for you to success?
Well, as I've said before, luck is a big factor in life, and I got lucky. I met somebody that got me an interview for a job that led to the White House. I met somebody that became a partner in my investment firm, and many things happened. But I do think luck is an important thing that you can help move along. But hard work, persistence, not taking no for an answer, learning how to get along with people, humility, learning how to communicate, all these factors are ones that enable many people to rise up above the circumstances they found themselves in at their birth. In our country, we generally have a belief that you can rise up. Now, many people in our country today, people particularly of minority backgrounds, feel they can't rise up. The system is too wetted against them. Ironically, people who live outside this country, who come to this country, believe in the American dream more than people who live in this country very often. And that's why we have 47 million people living in this country now who are immigrants to this country. No other country in the world has that many people coming there because they think they're getting a better life. So I got lucky along the way. Many of my friends have gotten lucky as well. Look at who would have thought when he came to this country that Elon Musk would wind up as the wealthiest man in the world.
Yeah.
Who would have thought when Jeff Bezos started his company that it would be one of the greatest companies in the world? I know I knew him then, and I told him I didn't think this was going to get anywhere.
Wow. You lay out 13 key genes, as you call them, for the American experiment. They are democracy, voting, equality, opportunities and rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, rule of law, separation of powers, civilian control of the military and peaceful transfer of powers, capitalism and entrepreneurship, immigration, diversity, culture, and the American dream. And you lay those out throughout the book. For you, as you look at that and as you put the book together, you did a lot of research, you did a lot of surveys, and you found what were other people seeing. As you've looked back now after you finished the book, are there any that stand out as critical genes or foundational genes that are more significant than the other?
Well, as I was writing the book, the events of January 6th came along, and clearly in other countries that might have led to a military takeover or some type of coup. If you were watching the events of January 6th and you were thinking what you were watching was some country other than the United States, you almost certainly thought there was going to be a military coup of some type. In this country, because we do believe in the rule of law, and 65 times courts threw out the fraud allegations that were being made, I do think that the rule of law probably is one of the great genes of our country. And what I meant by genes are, these are qualities that are endemic to the American fabric, the DNA. You can go to any country and they'll have their own genes. Mongolia, France, Algeria, South Africa, they all have their genes that are part of their body fabric. These are the ones I outlined. Now, there are 13 I mentioned. You could say there are more, but those are the ones that I think are most Americans probably agree on. For example, take diversity. Some Americans probably don't agree on it, but as a general rule of thumb today, there's a belief that diversity is a good social policy, and we should encourage diversity in hiring and education and so forth. That was not a gene 200 years ago, but now it is. I'd say the right to vote was always a gene in this country that's important, but clearly we're fighting over who has the right to vote today. So while people think it's important, some people think it's important that certain people maybe shouldn't be able to vote so easily.
Now, you've taken and created 6 key sections, the first being promise and principle, the second being suffering and sorrow, the third being restoration and repair, the fourth being innovation and ingenuity, the fifth being creation and culture, and the sixth being becoming and belonging. These seem like they fit into the 13 key genes. They feel like they're a part of it, that they're fundamental. How did you find those categories within it, the book, to categorize the different interviews and conversations?
Well, I don't want to make it sound like I went up to the mountain and there was a burning bush that said these are the 6 categories and you have to have this. There's no doubt that when you're trying to organize something, you want to give it to people in a way that seems digestible. So my publisher and I kind of came up with these 6 categories. I can't say that they're in stone, but I was, if I said, here are 25 interviews and just threw them out there, it doesn't give people the kind of sense of organization. So it's a way to organize things, but you could say that one thing could have been a different category or not, but just a way of organizing, really.
Yeah, the one thing I wish the book had more of was each chapter feels like, or each interview could be its own book. It's just, there's so much packed into it, and it feels like we're getting a highlight reel throughout each interview. Why did you decide on interviews versus putting out your own thoughts?
Well, a couple of reasons for that. It's a good question. One, I am by background a lawyer, a business person, an investor, and I have a lot of nonprofit responsibilities now. So I didn't think I could sit down and absent myself from all my other responsibilities and just spend 1 or 2 years writing a book. So one way to do that, overcome that problem, is to do interviews where I can ask the questions. A lot of the hard work is done by the interviewee. And I have been doing a lot of interviews in recent years from various television shows, other programs I have, so I can do it relatively easily. But to sit down and write a book all in my words, one, it's probably, I'm not sure I have that much to tell people that they want to listen to. But secondly, I just thought people would be interested in hearing from a diverse group of people, not just from me. I hope at some point I can write my own book without just interviews, but it's a technique that seems to have worked. This is the 3rd one. I have a 4th one coming out next year. And people seem to like the interviews because they're digestible. They're not too long. They're kind of edited to include some of my humor. And from time to time, I think people can learn something from them. But it's an interesting format. You and I are engaging in an interview right now. There were no interviews 100 years ago, 200 years ago. We don't have interviews of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Cleopatra, William Shakespeare. It's a relatively new information entertainment format. And I've often thought maybe I could do a book of people who are dead, and we'd like to hear what they would say. So I'll interview William Shakespeare, interview Mark Antony, interview Charlemagne, and say, tell us what the answers are to these questions. Obviously made up and would be somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But it's an interesting concept that people enjoy reading interviews because you're used to watching people being interviewed on television or podcasts, but we don't really publish interviews so much. We tend to publish regular books. My interview format is one that I thought would work in a book.
And I have to agree. I think it really does. I love the book, and that really stood out to me when you mentioned that interviews are a new medium for communication, really conversations. I was reading an interview that you did recently, and you said that you don't see yourself as a journalist in this endeavor. You see yourself as a conversationalist. Tell me the difference between a journalistic approach and a conversationalist, and why you feel like, because you do a lot of research, you put a lot of time into this, you are very versed in the topics that you're covering, and you're having educated conversations. So why do you consider yourself more of a conversationalist versus like a journalistic view of these interviews?
A couple of reasons. One, a journalist generally has no perceived biases. There are some bias. Nobody's perfect, but I'm a business person and a wealthy person, and therefore, if I'm going to be asking people questions, and I said I am a journalist, really forget my background, people are going to criticize me, saying, "Well, you are too wealthy to be asking these kind of questions, or you have a bias in favor of business or this." So I'm saying that I'm not a journalist who's trying to portray himself as completely unbiased. Secondly, I am never trying to embarrass anybody.
Right.
Some journalists want to get a scoop, want to embarrass somebody, want somebody to say something they probably prefer they didn't say. And that's just not what I do. So I try to let people know that I'm trying to educate people, inform them. If you want a hard-cutting interview, get Mike Wallace or Chris Wallace or somebody that's a tough journalist, and they'll do a better job at that than I do. That's just not what I do.
I've taken that approach myself with the podcast. I want to make the guest the hero. I want to make the audience the hero in this and really highlight what you have to bring to the table. So I really value that as an interviewer. And to hear that, I think it's just, there's a lot of divisiveness in the world. There's a lot of getcha moments. You see that in political journalism now. You see that in even historical interpretive world of journalism, that there's this, oh, I'm going to one up you. And I think it's really fresh and nice to see someone who's just saying, hey, I just want to have a conversation and highlight what you know and make you the center of telling an amazing story.
As a general rule of thumb, I don't like in my business life or in any other part of my life to embarrass people or make them uncomfortable. So I'm not going to try to do that in my interviews. Secondly, when I do watch people with this gotcha journalism, I actually cringe and feel bad for the interviewee and actually the interviewer, because it's an awkward moment and, I just don't enjoy watching it. So I tend to switch when I see that. I just prefer to do something different. And if people don't like the fact that I'm not trying to embarrass somebody, then they should just not listen or watch.
I think there is a space that a lot of people are kind of sick of that world of talking head journalism. So I really appreciate that approach that you do. How do you prepare for these interviews? How do you go into and make sure that you're going to have a great conversation? Because you hear some interviewers in podcasts world that say, I'm just going to show up and just see where the conversation leads. And I think that's really dishonoring to the guest. I think it's dishonoring to the conversation in a lot of ways.
There was a famous television interviewer, Larry King. You're maybe too young to remember him, but he was on television. I
remember him.
Okay. So he famously said, I don't do any preparation. I just come in and just ask off the top of my head. And he had a nice career doing that. In my own case, maybe because I'm trained as a lawyer, I want to be prepared. I feel that if I'm interviewing somebody that's written a book, I feel it's an obligation to read the book, and I always do. If it's somebody who hasn't written a book, I will read everything that's been written about him within reason in the last couple of years. And then what I do is I write down the questions that I am likely to ask, and it kind of frames in my mind how I want to do the interview. But the most important thing, as you know, when you're interviewing people, is you have to listen to what they say, because if you could ignore, they might say something really important. And if you're going to ignore it, you're going to miss a great part of the interview. So I always prepare to divert and go into certain areas, but the trick is to come back to what the core of the message is. And I tend to open by asking overly broad questions that are going to excite in a viewer and get them interested, and then take people through the trajectory of their career, and then ask some questions that, anybody on his own mind would like to know if they were asking, this kind of person questions. So I often pride myself, I guess, in asking questions that the average person would like to know, but might be afraid to ask. Not embarrassing ones, but ones that, you like, for example, if I interview I've interviewed the head of General Motors, and I would say, and as I did, and she's a friend of mine, I would never embarrass her. Say, look, when I go to buy a car, the salesman goes in the back room and says, I have to talk to my manager. What are they really doing in the back room? What are they really doing there? Are they really talking to their manager, or what are they doing? Or I asked the head of Exxon, is your gasoline really any better than the other guy's gasoline? Why isn't it the same? No, it's a humorous kind of thing, but I try to find some of those sometimes to ask.
I think preparation is such a hard thing to do, because I go into interviews and I've spent a lot of time preparing for this interview, and yet I still don't feel like I'm fully prepared. I don't know if you experienced that ever. Like you feel like, is there something I'm going to miss in the conversation? You mentioned listening and being aware of what people are saying and picking up on those little small things. And we've all listened to a podcast or seen an interview and said, why aren't you asking that question? How do you really know that you've prepared well? How do you know when you're picking up on the right things that people are going to go, that's the question I want asked?
If you're having a good interview, the person you're interviewing is engaged and they are happily following your lead, and they will open up. People are willing to open up about their background, their childhood. And once they're willing to do that and talk about things that might not be the traditional things, you know that they are engaged and they're interested. But many times I've interviewed prominent people, and then the next day they did an interview with somebody else and they made news doing that, or they were asked questions that I said I should have asked that. For example, I interviewed Joe Manchin not too long ago at the Economic Club of Washington, And 2 or 3 days later, he gave other interviews, and he gave me much more news in the other interviews than in mine. I said, why didn't I do a better job in asking those questions? So you always kind of have second doubts or second thoughts about why you didn't do a better job. But as a general rule of thumb, I try to get about 40 or so questions into a 45-minute interview, and that's about what you can fit in.
We're going to take a break right here, and when we come back, we'll continue the conversation with today's guest, David Rubenstein. We are excited about all the amazing things happening at jumbleThink. As I mentioned earlier in the show, we are launching the show in video format completely live, both on Facebook and YouTube. That's coming in the next couple weeks. I've been talking about it for a while, but I'm super excited that it's finally here. I want to make sure you never miss anything with that. And the best way to do that is to join our email newsletter. Simply go on over to jumbleThink.com and sign up for that newsletter. You'll also be able to download the free Dreamer's Guide to Micro Experiments when you do that. It's completely free, and it helps you on the journey of turning your dreams and ideas into reality. So never miss another update on what's going on new here at jumbleThink. Go join the jumbleThink newsletter by going on over to jumbleThink.com. Now let's jump back into today's conversation. Now, you have incredible guests. You have incredible interviews. How do you find the right people? How are you going and selecting? These are conversations I want to have that are important for today.
Well, my television show is called Peer to Peer. I didn't come up with a name, but it's kind of designed to connote that I'm interviewing people that are also reasonably prominent, but that I am not a journalist, and therefore I'm not quite the supplicant at the table begging them for an interview or saying, you're so great, let me hear some of your wisdom. Many of them know me, they respect me, they've either been in business with me, they've been in nonprofit things with me, and so they generally, I think, probably have some respect for me. And so getting those people to do interviews with me is not as hard as if I didn't know the people. When I'm trying to get an interview with somebody I've never met, have no contact with, I go through some of the same challenges that anybody does. If they're people that I know and they're probably going to have some interaction with me in the future, they probably will say, well, geez, I don't want to upset him. I'll do an interview and I know he won't embarrass me. So I do get a lot of people that, because of my social contacts or my nonprofit work or my business things, that make it much easier for me to do in terms of getting them.
Now, you mentioned that the book is obviously all interviews with a little commentary at the beginning of each chapter as you have each conversation. Was there a conversation that specifically stood out to you that you went, oh, whoa, I missed this. How did I miss this?
Well, some of the interviews are ones that I didn't know as much about as I thought I would. I did the preparation, and some of them, you didn't go quite the way you would expect. But take the one you referred to, Ken Burns. Ken is somebody I've known for quite some time. I've been a backer of his, and I think he really has done a spectacular job in his documentaries. But he is much more, strong-willed in his view about what went wrong in the Vietnam War than maybe I expected. He basically said the Vietnam War was in effect, a fraud by political leaders because they knew all along we couldn't win that war militarily, yet they kept insisting that we should pursue the war, even though they knew we couldn't win militarily. And as we know, 58,000 Americans died as a result of that, and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. And so he was pretty adamant about it, and not a soft-spoken documentarian you might have expected. So I wouldn't say surprised, but I was delighted that he was willing to be so frank about it. I didn't know as much about the Wright brothers as I thought I should know. And then when I read the book by David McCullough, it opened my eyes. And if you read that chapter, you'll know how difficult it was for these two bicycle makers to basically prove that man can fly when nobody else had been able to prove it. And it's quite an amazing story when you read it. And they spent about $1,000 on the whole effort.
Which is incredible. It's a really cool story. There were a couple interviews that personally for me stood out in various ways. The first one being Cal Ripken Jr. I grew up in central Pennsylvania as a kid who watched and loved the Baltimore Orioles, who one of my fondest memories is going with my parents to see one of the games at Camden Yard and just enjoying that whole experience and watching Cal Ripken Jr. as a kid. There were some interesting things in that his story that he shared with you. But I think one of them, of course, he has the record for most consecutive games, and he's this legacy in sports and beloved by many in the space. But one of the things that stood out to me was just his thoughts on longevity and pushing through. I wanted to bring that back to you a little bit. You are the co-founder of the Carlyle Group. You do all these philanthropic endeavors. You run multiple organizations in that space. You have a television show. You're writing these books. How do you keep focus? What are the things that keep you going where you can have such a high degree of performance like he did in your own life?
Well, I don't play golf. Maybe that gives me a lot of extra time. I don't know. I'm doing now any things I enjoy. So unfortunately I don't have to work to make a living. And fortunately, my financial situation is much better than I ever thought it would be. So while I'm still involved in the business world, I have time to pursue other things, and I can do things that I enjoy. And maybe everybody doesn't have that privilege or luxury right now. Secondly, I'm trying to get things done, and I'm racing to get things done because I'm now 72 years old. And that's an age when a lot of times people slow down, the body doesn't work as well, the brain doesn't work as well. So I'm racing to get things done. I call it sprinting to the finish line because you never know when something bad can happen. A very good friend of mine the other day came down with ALS. Something like that could strike any of us. Another friend of mine came down with glioblastoma, brain tumor. You don't know when these things are going to happen. So I'm trying to get things done before something bad happens and hopefully leave a legacy for my children and grandchildren that they would say, well, he wasn't such a bad guy and he did something useful with his life.
Another interview that really stood out to me was the Wynton Marsalis on jazz. And it stood out for me for multiple reasons. One, as a high school student, Wynton Marsalis came to my high school,
Wow.
and I got to see him play. There's a book called Blue Like Jazz by Donald Miller. And in the book, he says, until you experience jazz, you don't understand jazz. Until you put yourself into a place where you actually are enveloped by the sound and all of that. And for me, that was that moment where I went, oh, I get jazz a little bit more because I've seen a great performer in person.
Right.
And he does something really interesting. He talks about three fundamental elements of jazz. And I want to read this section. It's a very, very powerful section. The music has three fundamental elements. The first is improvisation, which is our kind of individuality and what we believe in. We have rights and freedoms that are all about the individual. Then swing, when it's all about nurturing common ground, finding balance with others, working out agenda as you go along under the pressure of time. And then the blues. The blues is an optimism that is not naive. The blues also implies acuity. There's a democratic thing. And I thought that was a powerful statement because I think that often we don't go to the depths of really understanding how there's impact beyond that. And to put that in the context of not just music, although jazz is the American songbook, but it's that one step further to say it's also the music of our culture, our democracy. I think that's a powerful statement.
Well, Wynton Marsalis, as you know, is from a very prominent family. Sadly, his father died from COVID during this period of time.
Yeah.
But his brothers are quite involved as well in jazz. Wynton is probably the personification of jazz today. He leads Lincoln Center, Jazz at Lincoln Center now. But for him, jazz, and he's written about this in a book, is a religious experience.
Yeah.
It's more than just music. It's type of a religious thing that is just transcends just the sound. And, he just tried to describe what it means to be improvisational in jazz and why that's one of the appeals of jazz. And he did, most interestingly in the interview, he did talk about, quite frankly, racism in the country. And I asked him, well, look, you're a very prominent person. I assume you don't have racism now because you're so famous. He said, no, I had it my whole life. I still have it. And I'm going to live with it. And I recognize that the country isn't perfect in this regard. So you often forget the fact that even prominent African Americans, for example, still suffer racism. People might not know who they are. They treat them like they would treat just somebody else who might be African American, not famous. So it just brings home the whole racism issue that we're struggling with in our country for hundreds of years.
Yeah, that was really eye-opening to me when he talked about the New York Times and how they cover jazz versus other genres of music and how they approach it. And I didn't realize that. And again, that comes back to a centralized theme of the book, which is this concept of maybe we don't know as much as we think we know. And one of the themes that I think is really common, it starts right at the beginning of the book with Jill Lepore, where it was talking about destructive mythology. And Witten brings that up in his interview about like this concept of almost like a folklore. Jill mentions about how it's the language, the technology of communication that actually laid the foundation for our history, the written recorded word versus the narrative word. And so there's this watering down of our history because it's an incomplete story told.
Yes, I mean, Jill Lepore really opens the book a bit, talking about her comprehensive history of America. And interestingly, she's the first woman to have written a comprehensive history of the United States. Yeah. So when you and I were going to school, all the books were written by men, and she brings a much different perspective to it. One of the most interesting stories that she told in the interview was that when she went to some, I think it was a third grade school, and she was talking about the founding fathers with third graders and said, well, what about the women back then? What do you think of them? And a little girl said, well, they didn't have women back then. And that's because all the men had written all the histories, and they didn't think there was anything valuable that women had done, in the early days. And as we now know, that of course women were very much involved in the Revolutionary War and other things, but they didn't get any attention for it.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I think it was her interview. It may have been somebody else's where they mentioned, I think it was John Adams' wife writing him a letter saying, what about the women? And I think it's interesting that was, we think about that time of history being obviously very, very driven by men, white men, but we don't think about the voice of the spouses. And I think it's really profound that question was being asked even then at that time.
There are about 1,000 letters between John Adams, obviously an articulate and well-educated person, and Abigail Adams, who was not particularly educated. Her letters seem to be much more interesting and much more perceptive than his letters, frankly. And what she did is, when he was at the Declaration of Independence, at the Second Continental Congress, they're getting ready to declare independence, and she said to him, remember the women. And he wrote back to her, well, don't worry about the women. You guys take care of your kind of women's issues. I'll take care of the government. Very dismissive. But actually, she was very, very perceptive, as it turned out, and did quite impressive things. But that's the way it looked in those days. And remember, when the country was started, while we have these principles that all men are created equal, and that's the creed of the country, the truth was women had no rights. They couldn't vote, and they certainly couldn't even own property if they were married in their own name. African Americans couldn't vote, and a lot of only property people really who had some property could really vote. So you had basically white men with property who were able to do the voting. And so it wasn't quite the democracy that we now think it was supposed to be.
Yeah, and I want to take that one step further. One of the concepts, I grew up in the world of evangelical Christianity. I know that you come from a Jewish background. And for me, I enjoyed some of the history of the church that was stuff that I hadn't learned. Now, you mentioned Whitefield in one of the interviews there. That was somebody I'm very aware of. And so, but the concept that I thought was really profound, and this isn't something I was going to go in this conversation with, but I think it's really powerful, is that religion and organized religion has been a mechanism that has been used by minorities throughout history to find their voice, especially in American history. You see women in the suffrage movement use it. You see it in the South with Black freed slaves using it as a mechanism for the civil rights movement. And so what is it that religion does to allow people to find that voice?
Well, religion has existed since, we know anything about history. And generally, I think it's a view that people can't quite understand how they got here and who created them. So you have to figure out that there must be something greater than humans, and kind of religion has arisen. In the book, I point out and interviewed a very distinguished religion professor from Harvard, that in the early days of this country, we like to think that this was a place where there was religious freedom. It was the opposite. Yeah. People came here from England to get away from worshiping a certain way, but when they got here, they didn't want anybody to worship differently than they were worshiping.
Right.
And it was very unusual to have something in our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, that actually said there's no state religion. But actually, many people before we got to that point actually thought that if you didn't have a certain religious view, you should get out of the colony. For example, Roger Williams was pushed out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had to go create Rhode Island because he had different views than the people in Massachusetts Bay Colony. My home state of Maryland was a state that was founded for Catholics because Catholics weren't welcome in other parts of the colonies. So very interesting.
Yeah, I put a note down in my one of the pages about that. I said it was like religious segregation based on what was tolerated in that specific community or state or colony at that point. I just never realized that we were really divided in a lot of ways, even at our foundation.
Thomas Jefferson and James Madison tried to get legislation through the Virginia House of Burgesses, which ultimately passed 11 years after they started, that said there was no organized religion. You're free to worship whatever you want. But that was a relatively revolutionary concept. People generally thought the religion of the colony is the religion everybody should have. And if you didn't have that religion, you're in trouble. And think about this. Thomas Jefferson, who was, the drafter of the Declaration of Independence, third president and so forth, when the Library of Congress was burned, when the British invaded in 1814, he offered to sell what was then the biggest private library in the United States to the Library of Congress so they would have books again. And the members of Congress said, well, we don't really trust him because he doesn't believe in Jesus Christ the way that we do. So we have to go and examine every one of his books to make sure there's nothing that's sacrilegious in any of these books. So they examined all, I think, several thousand of his books before they agreed that it was okay to buy them.
Oh my goodness. I had no idea. That's insane. We're going to take a break, and in a moment, we'll be back to continue the conversation with today's guest, David Rubenstein. Whether you're a new listener or a longtime fan, if you've never subscribed to JumbleThink, you should go do it. Head on over to jumblethinking.com, where you'll find links to Apple Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, or more. Or head over wherever you like to listen to podcasts and subscribe to JumbleThink. We've got some great things in store for you in 2022, and we don't want you to miss a thing. So go subscribe to the show now. Now let's return to today's conversation with David Rubenstein. I want to pivot here to an area that I know is part of your foundation. It's something that I stumbled upon out of necessity, and that's the world of entrepreneurship, the world of innovation, the world of small business and large business for that matter. I ended up in entrepreneurship because of the recession. I had worked at a church. They couldn't afford to pay me any longer because a lot of their funding came from people involved in construction. And so I volunteered there and ended up in the world of web design and development. I've done quite well over the years. But for you, was this a section of the book that was significant in a unique way compared to some of the other sections because of your affinity and connection to the world of business?
Well, yes. I want people to know that, in fact, one of the things that really makes the United States different is the sense that you can create something out of whole cloth and make a big business out of it or a nonprofit out of it. And that's what this country was. We created this country out of whole cloth. There was no concept of creating a whole country before the United States came along. Countries weren't created out of whole cloth. The 13 colonies came together and fighting a revolutionary war. They created a new country. And what we've done here in this country is we honor the idea of creating something new. You know, the word entrepreneur is a word that's actually French and in origin, but it's one that's really much more relevant here. You see relatively few entrepreneurs in France. You see many more people here starting companies. And in fact, it's very difficult for some of the best employers now to get people from the best universities because they don't want to work at big companies. They want to be entrepreneurs. Everybody wants to do their own startup. Yeah. And it's an incredible concept that you can create something out of whole cloth, it'll grow, and you can maybe live the American dream. So entrepreneurship is very important to this country. And I went through in the book so many inventions that have really started in this country, and people grew great companies from them.
The parallel that you made, and I've never seen this made, or in the interview that the line was made, was between Florence and Silicon Valley, and how Silicon Valley is in a lot of ways a modern Florence of innovation, of creativity. And I think that's a powerful picture.
Yes, and Florence was in the time of the I would say the enlightened period of time, or the Renaissance, where people went to create things. This is where Michelangelo would be, or Leonardo, or other people. Well, now if you want to create a company, you move to Silicon Valley. It's changed a bit now. People are moving to Austin and other places. Yeah. But when Mark Zuckerberg wanted to create his company, he went to Silicon Valley. He was from New York. So That's where there was a certain infrastructure that enabled people to get things going. And that's where a lot of great companies came from. And you think about our entrepreneurship, think about this 25 years ago, just 25 years ago, there was no Google, there were no smartphones. There was essentially people weren't living off of their social media contacts. Now, suppose before you had Facebook, before you had Apple, before you had Google, before you had Microsoft, it's amazing that humans could live without these things. Now you can't live without them.
I was born in 1981. I'm 40 this year, and I feel very fortunate that I've lived through a unique time in history. But in this unique time of history, it seems like there's also been more fragmentation of society,
For sure.
whether it's politics, whether it's religion, whether it's reimagining and rethinking what race can mean like in the future. These conversations are coming up, and there's a lot of things I wanted to cover here today. We're simply not going to have the time, but the past 2 years especially have been difficult. COVID, politics, the world has been filled with just uncertainty. Do you feel like you're an optimist or a realist or a pessimist in the potential of the American experiment in the future of where we go from here?
Well, I'd like to remind people, look, during the Civil War, the country split in two, and we had, 600, 700,000 people killed as a result of it. Here, the country is split in two. We don't quite have a civil war, but we have a country bitterly divided over whether to take vaccines or not, for example, or whether a certain person was elected president or not legitimately. Our country is split down the middle. Fortunately, we're not going to military combat, though we did have a version of that, you could argue, on January the 6th. I would say that the country does need something to kind of pull it together. I don't know who or what it will be, but the way we're moving now, the country is a country of what Dickens would say, a tale of two cities.
Yeah.
You have the haves and the have-nots, and very often the have-nots resent the people that have the haves. Very often the haves look down upon the have-nots. It's not a good situation, and I think a lot of people today are very unhappy with the future of the country. In my own case, like you, I'm an optimist probably because if you've created something from nothing and you've seen something happen, you probably tend to think that things can get better. There's no doubt that we have a lot of challenges, but every time in history, people will say, yes, this is a difficult time. It was always better before. People would say it's really bad now. And so I think we're just repeating history. It's bad now, but there have been bad times before, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that I tend to agree with you. I am hopeful. I am filled with optimism that conflict can birth change and bring hope and bring change that brings more of that equality of economics, of race, of gender, that these things can come to fruition out of the pain. And that's one of the other highlights of the book for me is like suffering is a tool that gets us to good things sometimes.
Well, that's kind of, you could argue, a religious principle that may come from your religious background.
Yeah.
That suffering ultimately will produce some good benefit. And that's what, to some extent, many religions are based on, that you should suffer and eventually you'll have salvation. I suppose you would know better than I whether that's part of what you believe in. But I would say there's no doubt that many people think that you have to go through trials and tribulations before you're going to get to the so-called promised land. And that's what keeps people moving forward, is they think that if they do put in hard work and they do suffer a bit, they eventually will come out better.
Now, we talked a little bit about entrepreneurship in the book, and I wanted to ask three specific questions because we have a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to the show. And this may not be as focused on the book. There's a lot of there that I wanted to go to. There's lots of good things about business right now. 27% of all small businesses are being started because people are dissatisfied with corporate America. There is half of all small businesses right now are being started by minorities. These are good things that people are saying there's opportunity here. Those people who want to take that risk, and America's always been a center for risk takers, for people stepping out into the unknown. What is it that you would tell them? This is some things you need to know about the world of business and entrepreneurship before you take that leap.
Well, when you take a leap or you start a business, you have to recognize that 99% of businesses that are started, maybe 99.9%, don't work.
Yeah.
So you might hear about the Googles and the Facebooks, but you're not going to hear about the ones that don't work. So you have to be, careful that it's not going to be that easy. You have to work hard. You have to be committed to it. You have to really believe in it. You have to be willing to say yes when people tell you no. You just have to be persistent. It's not easy. Again, I got lucky in my business. It got off the ground and so forth. You've obviously done very well also, but we have to remember that it's a challenge and it's not easy to get things going, because if you told people you're going to start the business that you started, people probably said to you, "What, are you crazy? You can't start a business like that. That's not a business, right?"
Yeah.
And they told me the same thing. So you just have to persist, and in the end, remember that if you work hard, you have some luck, you probably can make it work.
There's two questions I really debated on asking, and I know that people want to ask these questions, and so I'm going to go ahead and ask them. If they're inappropriate, let me know, and
Go ahead.
we won't ask them. But you are incredibly wealthy. You are, according to statistics, a billionaire. There's a lot of perceptions around what it looks like to be a billionaire, and as a person that's done really well, that's been incredibly successful, what is it that you would want people to know about success that they might not know, or about those
Oh,
opportunities?
well, first, when I was growing up in the United States, there might have been one billionaire, a man named Dan Ludwig, a ship owner. Today, there are lots of people. It's not that unique to have a considerable amount of money by traditional standards. But the most important thing is money doesn't buy happiness. Many of the most tortured people I know are very, very wealthy. So if you think that you're going to get happy and be happiness, which is the most important thing in life, is personal happiness, assuming it's not involved in hurting other people. How do you get that? Well, it's not by making money, because a lot of people who make a lot of money aren't happy. So if you want to be successful and make money, make sure you know why you're doing it. I presume it's for something other than having a bunch of yachts and homes. It's presumably to be able to give away money or help your family or things like that. But I would say, happiness is more important than having wealth for sure. And I am a pretty, happy person, relatively speaking. But, you can always be happier, I suppose. If I was more accomplished, I got things done. I could dunk a basketball. I could, get a hole in one. I don't have those skills.
Neither do I. I wish I did. It would be fun to have them, but I don't either. The last question for the segment that I wanted to ask is that in your career, you've had some amazing relationships with presidents. I've wanted to have one on the show for a long time, never have yet. But you worked in the White House for Jimmy Carter. You had George H.W. Bush as a part of your advisors for the Carlyle Group. You have a relationship with President Biden. Now, look, I'm always straight up about my bias. I am a moderate conservative, more on the conservative side. But no matter who's in office, I want them to succeed for America. And as a person that has seen different presidents, worked with different presidents, what would you say about the perception we have about those leadership that could bring some better understanding to that world?
Well, we've now kind of asked presidents to be all things to all people. They're supposed to be Superman. They're brilliant. They have to be great speakers. They have to work around the clock. They have to be nice to everybody. They can't lose their temper. It's hard to do all these things and also control the world where there's 7.5 billion people in it and 330 million people in this country. It's an impossible task, really. Yeah. Much easier than than years ago when the country was much smaller. So I think all presidents are humans. They have their weaknesses, their fallacies, their insecurities. It's not a job that really I highly recommend to people unless you really, really know what you're doing and you have some real strong convictions about something. But you have to remember the system is set up to make presidents fail.
Yeah.
And so how many presidents have we had who left office where people said, wow, they were really, really successful in recent times? I mean, clearly, look what's happened to a lot of them. John Kennedy was killed. Lyndon Johnson driven out of office. Richard Nixon driven out of office. My boss, Jimmy Carter, was defeated for re-election. George Herbert Walker Bush defeated for re-election. So Donald Trump has the challenges that he was defeated for re-election. So lots of challenges. It's not a job where at the end of the day, you're going to get your reputation made even better than it was before, I think. So obviously there are some people that have emerged with reasonably good reputations afterwards. I think Barack Obama did after his presidency. But, it's not an easy job.
We're going to take a break right here. When we come back, it's rapid fire questions. Fire questions, I wanted to take a moment and pause and say thank you. Thank you for tuning into jumbleThink, whether it's just for today's conversation or for the last several years of the podcast. It is an honor to have you along for the ride. It means the world to me that you would listen. And my hope is pretty simple, that these conversations, that these ideas would spark something inside of you, a desire to step into the unknown, to chase the dreams and ideas inside of you, and to change the world around you. I believe that you were created for something awesome and that your dreams and ideas are significant and they matter. So thank you for tuning into today's conversation. Thank you for being a listener of jumbleThink. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you for the years to come. Now let's jump into rapid fire questions.
Levez seulement le bras pour mettre l'aiguille sur le disque.
We are back with David Rubenstein to do rapid fire questions. David, are you ready?
Yes, go ahead.
As a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, when I was very young, a professional baseball player, but that didn't work out.
What is one tip you give someone with a big idea or dream and they don't know where to start?
Well, start small. Don't try to conquer the whole world initially. Do it one step at a time and things can work out.
What is one change you'd like to see in the world?
Well, greater harmony between countries and people living a little bit longer, particularly those who are 72 years old, living another 30 years or so and with good health. That would be a good change for people.
We're getting close to 400 episodes on the show, and I've interviewed a lot of people. When I researched you, one of the things that stood out to me was your intentional choices on the legacy you are building, the things that you're leaving behind, how you're investing your money into those things that you believe in. Right. What is the legacy you want to leave?
Well, I hope that people will think that I did something useful with the money that I was fortunate enough to get. I didn't just buy a whole bunch of homes and yachts and things like that, that I tried to give back to the country in ways that would remind people of the history and heritage of this country. And that hopefully people would think that I was, a good citizen and a good American.
Yeah, one of those things that I thought was profound that I found was your investment into the Washington Monument. Right in the center of Washington. It's such a valuable monument to our history.
Yes, it was a monument to George Washington. Didn't open until about 100 years after he was born, or after he was born, yes. And it took a while to get it done, and then it had an earthquake damage, and I put up some money to fix it and so forth.
Where do you find inspiration?
Well, when I read what young people are doing to build new companies and do nonprofit kinds of things, and when I see the great works that people have created in the art world, the performing arts world, inspirational things, or just basically when you see people that come from modest backgrounds achieving something great, you realize they've overcome real handicaps and therefore they deserve a lot of credit.
What's one book you think every dreamer should read?
Well, I think the most important book is the Bible. You've got, so much about human history and human life and human experiences there. So if you're going to read one book, I would try to read the Bible.
How do you define success?
Well, success to some extent is in the eyes of other people. So other people think you're successful, and maybe you are. But I think success is more emotional and spiritual and not material.
What is one trend you're currently excited about?
Well, I'm excited about the idea that we can improve people's health and let people live a longer period of time, because a lot of extraordinary things are being done in biopharmacy and so forth, and biotech kinds of things, so that people will not, when they get to my age, feel that their body's going to collapse or my brain is going to collapse. So I'm hopeful that people will be able to live to 100 years old with a healthy life.
What is one habit that you find helpful in your life?
I think generally preparing for things. Jim Baker used to say that his father drilled into him the idea that prior preparation prevents poor performance. Yeah. And I think Jim Baker may have drilled it into me. So I do try to prepare for things to the extent I can and be ready for challenges when they come along.
What is one thing you wish you would have known when you first started out?
Well, I wish I had known that this is a harder business to get off the ground than you might think. And probably, I need more help. But generally, I wish I had known that, the things that's going to give me the greatest satisfaction are not making money, but giving back to other people.
Yeah. I found that as one of the profound things from the innovation section with Walter Isaac's interview was that he drilled into the fact that creativity and a team are what builds success and innovation. Right. And I thought that was really profound.
Yes, he pointed out there are no individuals out there like Albert Einstein coming up with brilliant ideas all the time, and they do it by themselves. People are building on other ideas that people have come before them with, and then they typically do it in teams. Apple had two people at the beginning, for example. Google had two people at the beginning, really. And so most great companies, actually not one person doing it. There's some exceptions, of course.
If you weren't doing what you're doing today, what do you think you'd be doing?
Well, if I wasn't doing what I was doing today, I'd probably be teaching somewhere and writing just full time, teaching and writing and kind of dealing with younger people.
Now, I heard a story that at your house overlooking the ocean, you have a stone that said, "I'd rather be working." Is that true?
Somebody gave me that because generally I am a pretty good workaholic and I enjoy working more than, things like playing golf or relaxing. I'm not that great a relaxer, but that's okay. I get my relaxation by working.
And our final rapid fire question is, what is one dream you are still wanting to fulfill in your own life?
Well, I'd like to live to be 100 years old and have good health and have my children and grandchildren actually think I did something useful with my life.
And we always like to leave our guests have a final thought. For all of us listening, what do you want to leave us with today?
That the most important thing that Americans should be doing is trying to find a way to bridge the gap between the various gulfs we now have, and that if this country is going to be the great country it's been the last 100 years or so, we need to make certain that we find ways to bridge the gap. Because right now, the divisiveness between different parts of our society is such that I worry that in time, other countries will become more important and powerful and a better place to live than our country.
Thank you so much for coming on to jumbleThink. It's been an honor to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. And you got a great virtual background there.
Thanks. Wow, it has been an honor to have today's guest, David Rubenstein, on the show. The book is killer. It's called The American Experiment, Dialogues on a Dream. These conversations are a lot of fun. I have enjoyed every moment of reading this book, and I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, check out the links in the episode notes to what David's doing, both with this book, his other books, and his TV shows. Go get the book. Read it. I think it will really challenge your thoughts on what America is and could be, what the American dream is really all about. So once again, I want to thank David for joining. It is a privilege to have him on the show. And again, I want to thank you for listening. It is an honor to have you along for these conversations. But now it's your turn. It's your turn to dream big. It's your turn to chase those ideas. It's your turn to change the world around you. Don't just sit by and let life pass you by. Choose to engage. Choose to step out. Choose to go into the unknown. So get